Rafe Turner had been stationed on the remote moon for almost 3 months. It was a quiet place, far from the bustling cities on Earth, a place where research was the only thing keeping the lonely station alive. His job was to study the alien species known as the Verari. But there was one thing that made this job different from any other. The Verari never spoke. Rafe had read about them before coming to the station. They were a peaceful, intelligent species, known for their silence. They communicated with each other through gestures and a kind of telepathy that Rafe couldn't quite understand. But none of them ever spoke aloud. Not a single word. Among the Verari, there was one woman who caught Rafe's attention more than the others. Her name was Lyra. She had been at the station for nearly as long as Rafe. But unlike the other Verari, Lyra always seemed different. There was something about her eyes, the way they seemed to look straight into him, as if she could see things that he couldn't. It was as if she knew things she couldn't or wouldn't say. Rafe had tried to talk to her many times, but she never responded. Her silence wasn't just because she didn't understand him. It was something deeper, something more mysterious. She would look at him, nod when necessary, but never a word left her lips. It made Rafe curious. What was it that kept her silent? Was it just cultural, or was there something else? Something more painful. One morning, Rafe was called to the central control room. A system failure had caused the station's power to fluctuate, threatening to shut down the entire research operation. As he arrived, the crew was already scrambling to fix the issue, but Rafe noticed Lyra standing quietly at the back of the room. She wasn't part of the crew, but she had been brought along for research purposes. Normally, she wouldn't be involved in the station's technical matters, but today was different. Today, she looked more focused than ever. Rafe approached her, trying to make sense of the situation. "Lyra," he asked softly, but she didn't answer, just turned her head slightly to acknowledge his presence. The problem was becoming more serious. Power levels were dropping, and the backup systems weren't kicking in fast enough. The control room was filled with the sound of alarms and people shouting commands at each other. But Lyra remained calm. She was standing near one of the backup systems, her eyes fixed on the glowing panels. Something about the way she was standing, the way she observed the situation, told Rafe that she knew exactly what to do. Without thinking, Rafe moved closer to her. "Do you know what's happening?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if she would answer. But Lyra didn't speak. Instead, she reached out with one long, graceful hand and pressed it to a panel on the wall. The moment her fingers touched the surface, the lights flickered and then steadied. The alarms stopped blaring. Power levels began to stabilize. Rafe watched in awe. He had never seen anything like it. He knew the Verari were connected to the station's systems somehow, but this was beyond anything he had expected. Lyra didn't look at him. She just returned to her quiet observation, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Lyra, you fixed it?" Rafe asked in disbelief. She didn't respond. There was no need for words. She had done it. And for some reason, she had chosen to do it now, in front of him. It felt like she was trying to show him something that only she could understand. Rafe knew then that he had to figure out what was going on with Lyra. There was more to her silence than he had realized. The way she interacted with the station, the way she seemed to be connected to it, it all pointed to something deeper. But why wouldn't she speak? Was it a vow, a choice, or something more complicated? Over the next few days, Rafe couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Every time he saw Lyra, his curiosity grew. He had read all the reports about the Verari, but none of them explained why she acted the way she did. No one had given him answers. He had to find out for himself. One afternoon, as he was walking to the research lab, he saw Lyra sitting in the common room, staring out the window at the barren moon's surface. Her expression was distant, as if she wasn't really there, as if she was lost in thought. Rafe hesitated, then made his way over to her. "Lyra," he began softly. "Why don't you speak?" He asked the question without expecting an answer, but he had to ask. It felt like the only way to move forward. She turned slowly to face him, her dark eyes meeting his. She didn't speak, but for the first time, Rafe saw something new in her gaze. It wasn't just the usual calmness or detachment. There was pain there, hidden beneath the surface. For a moment, he wondered if she was looking at him like that because she understood his question, perhaps better than he did himself. Lyra's gaze lingered for a few moments longer before she stood up and walked away without a word. Rafe stood there, feeling more confused than ever. What was it that kept her silent? What happened to her? He didn't know, but he was more determined than ever to find out. The days that followed the power surge felt strange to Rafe. He couldn't stop thinking about Lyra, the way she had fixed the system without saying a word. It made him wonder just how much the Verari really understood about the technology on the station. Was it their culture, or was there something more to it? And why had Lyra, of all the Verari, stepped in to help? Rafe spent the next few days trying to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to that moment in the control room. It was as if Lyra had unlocked a part of the station that no one else could access. But it wasn't just the station's systems she seemed to understand. It was the way she had moved, the calmness in her eyes. There was something about her, something different, and Rafe couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. One evening, while the station was quieter than usual, Rafe found himself in the mess hall, sipping his coffee and staring out the window at the empty landscape of the moon. It was peaceful, but it also felt lonely. That's when he noticed Lyra sitting at the far end of the room, by herself, staring into space as usual. She was always alone, always so distant. Rafe hesitated. He knew she didn't speak, but something inside him told him he had to try again. Maybe he could break through. Maybe he could finally get her to open up. He stood up and walked over to her, carefully choosing his words. "Lyra," he began softly, "I don't understand. Why did you help with the power system? You don't have to do that." Lyra didn't look at him. She just sat there, her hands folded on the table in front of her, as if she hadn't heard him. Rafe waited for a response, but none came. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. But this time, something was different. Rafe noticed her fingers twitching slightly, as though she was struggling with something. There was a faint tremor in her hand, something he hadn't seen before. He leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have to stay silent, Lyra. I won't judge you." Lyra's head snapped up, her dark eyes locking onto his. Rafe froze. In that instant, it felt like the world had stopped. Her eyes were filled with something he couldn't describe. Something like fear, something deeper than just silence. She looked at him as if he had asked her to do something impossible. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, her eyes fluttered for a second, and she suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Without a word, she walked quickly out of the room, leaving Rafe standing there, stunned. Rafe sat back down, his heart racing. What had just happened? It was as if she had wanted to speak, but something had stopped her. What was so difficult about it? He had seen the way she reacted to the power systems, how she seemed to understand things that no one else did. But when it came to speaking, she froze. The next day, Rafe was in the lab, running some routine tests, when he received an unexpected visitor. Lyra stood at the door, looking at him with that same unreadable expression. She didn't speak, but she had a slight hesitation in her step, as if she wasn't sure whether she should be here or not. "Lyra," Rafe asked cautiously, not sure what to expect. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer him. Instead, she walked over to a nearby console and pointed at the screen. The station's main systems were displaying a new issue, something about a malfunction in one of the auxiliary reactors. It wasn't a critical issue, but it would cause trouble if left unattended. Rafe stared at the screen, then back at Lyra. "You know about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the screen. Rafe could see the focus in her gaze, the determination. But there was something else in her eyes too, something more personal, something deeper. "I'll take care of it," Rafe said, ready to get to work, but Lyra shook her head. She gestured toward herself and then the console, as if asking him to follow her lead. Raf's heart skipped a beat. Did she want to help? She had never directly offered assistance before. Hesitant but trusting his gut, Rafe followed her to the reactor room. The air inside the reactor chamber was thick with tension, the hum of machinery filling the silence. Lyra moved quickly, her fingers dancing over the control panels, her actions smooth and practiced. Rafe stood by, watching in awe. It was like she was one with the machine, as if the reactor was an extension of herself. Lyra glanced at Rafe, and for the first time, there was something in her expression, something that resembled a question. She was looking to him, waiting for a sign. Rafe nodded. He wasn't sure what she needed, but he would follow her lead. In a few minutes, the problem was fixed. The reactor hummed back to life, and the systems began running smoothly again. Rafe looked at Lyra, his mind racing. She hadn't spoken a word, but she had guided him through the process as if she had known exactly what needed to be done. It was clear now. Lyra wasn't just silent because of her culture. There was something more to her silence, something locked away that Rafe hadn't yet understood. As they walked back to the main station, Rafe tried to catch her eye. "Thank you," he said, but again, she didn't speak. Lyra paused for a moment, looking at him as though she were deciding whether to say something. She opened her mouth, but once again, no words came out. Her face softened, and she simply walked away. Rafe was left standing there, more certain than ever that Lyra was holding something back. The question wasn't whether she could speak. It was why she wouldn't. And now, more than ever, Rafe was determined to find out. Rafe couldn't stop thinking about Lyra. Her silence was more than just a cultural quirk. It was something deeper. She wasn't like the other Ferrari. There was something in her eyes that haunted him, something that suggested her silence wasn't voluntary. It was as if she was trapped in her own mind, unable to escape. For days, Rafe did his best to focus on his work, but he kept finding himself watching Lyra from a distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her silence than he understood. He had to know what it was, and he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. One evening, he decided to visit the station's research library. It was quiet, a perfect place to dig through old records about the Ferrari. He sat down in front of a screen and began searching through the archives. Most of the information was standard, notes about their biology, their history, their culture, but nothing explained why Lyra had been so different. As he scrolled, a particular entry caught his eye. It was about the Ferrari's communication methods, something called mind resonance. According to the document, the Ferrari had the ability to share thoughts and emotions with each other. It was a form of silent communication that didn't rely on words, but it was more than just a mental connection. It was deeply personal, and it required great trust. Rafe's heart raced as he read. Could this be the key? Was it possible that Lyra wasn't speaking because of some deep mental barrier, something more complex than just cultural silence? The more he read, the more questions he had. He knew that the Ferrari had experienced some kind of trauma in the past. Many of their people had been destroyed by a war. But what did that have to do with Lyra's silence? That night, Rafe couldn't sleep. His mind was spinning with new information. He had to try something bold. He couldn't just watch Lyra suffer in silence. She needed help, and Rafe was determined to be the one to provide it. The next morning, he decided to approach Lyra again. She was sitting in the same spot as always, staring out the window at the barren moon. He hesitated for a moment before walking over to her. This time, he wasn't going to ask her why she wouldn't speak. Instead, he was going to offer something different. "Lyra," he said softly, "I know you don't talk, but I need to ask you something. Can I help you?" She didn't look at him, but Rafe could see her fingers twitch, just like before. There was hesitation in the way she held herself, like she was trying to decide whether to trust him or not. Rafe took a deep breath. I don't know what happened to you. I don't know why you're silent. But I want to help. You don't have to carry this alone. Lyra didn't respond, but for the first time, Rafe saw something new in her eyes, a flicker of curiosity. It was as if she was considering his words, weighing them in her mind. Please, he added gently, let me help you. She stood up abruptly, and Rafe thought she was going to leave. But instead, she walked toward him, her eyes fixed on his. There was no fear in her gaze, just uncertainty. Slowly, she reached out with one hand and placed it on his arm. Rafe froze. It was the first time she had made physical contact with him. A strange feeling passed through him, something he couldn't explain. It was as if his mind had momentarily connected with hers, a brief spark of awareness. He could feel her presence in his thoughts, not through words, but through emotions, fear, sadness, and a deep, painful loss. Rafe didn't pull away. Instead, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to focus on that connection. He didn't know if he was doing it right, but he knew one thing for sure. This was the key. Lyra had let him in, if only for a moment. She was reaching out to him, but she didn't know how to say what was on her mind. Then it happened. For a split second, he felt something like a voice, not in words, but in a rush of images and feelings. It was a flood of memories, destruction, loss, running from something, from someone. And then silence. The silence that had trapped her. Rafe gasped, pulling away. His head spun. He had never experienced anything like that before. It was as if he had briefly stepped into her mind, into her memories, and felt everything she had felt. Lyra was standing there, her hand still outstretched, her face unreadable. But Rafe could see it now. She wasn't just silent because of her culture or her choice. She had been silenced by something far more painful, something she couldn't bear to speak about. I felt it, Rafe said, his voice shaking. Lyra, I felt your pain, your fear. Lyra's eyes widened, and for the first time, there was something like a tear in her eye. She quickly wiped it away, as if embarrassed. But Rafe understood. The connection had been brief, but it was enough for him to see that Lyra had suffered something terrible. Something that had scared her so deeply that she couldn't bear to speak about it. I won't push you, Rafe said gently, but I'll be here when you're ready. Lyra didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away, leaving Rafe standing there, feeling both closer to her and further away than ever before. As she disappeared down the hallway, Rafe's mind raced. He had unlocked a part of her, but the path ahead wasn't clear. What had happened to Lyra? What was it that had caused her silence? And could he help her find her voice again? He didn't know, but he was more determined than ever to find out. Rafe couldn't shake the feeling of Lyra's touch, the way her hand had rested on his arm, the brief moment of connection. It had been more than just physical. It was as if she had let him into a world that she had locked away, a world full of pain and memories. He had felt her fear, her loss, and the weight of something terrible. But what had happened to her? What had caused the silence? For the next few days, Rafe focused on Lyra, watching her from a distance. She continued to stay isolated, always keeping to herself. The other Vereri acted as they always did, calm and distant. But there was something different about Lyra. The connection they had shared felt like a broken thread, and Rafe knew that if he wanted to understand her, he would have to try again. One afternoon, Rafe was walking through the station's corridors when he spotted Lyra standing near the observation window, staring out at the endless blackness of space. She looked as lost as ever, her eyes distant and cold, as if she were staring at something far beyond the stars. Rafe walked up to her slowly, his heart pounding. He didn't want to push her, but he couldn't stop himself from trying. Lyra, he said quietly, we need to talk. She didn't turn to look at him, but Rafe could feel the weight of her presence, as if she were aware of every step he took. He stood beside her, watching the stars with her. He didn't speak right away. Sometimes silence was more powerful than words. After a long pause, Lyra finally spoke. It was barely a whisper, but it was the first time she had spoken to him directly. "You felt it," she said, her voice soft but clear. Rafe nodded. "Yes, I did. I don't understand what it means, but I felt your fear, your pain." Lyra's gaze remained fixed on the stars, her expression unreadable. "It's not just fear," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's memories." Raf's breath caught in his throat. Memories. He was shocked by her response. She was speaking, really speaking. What kind of memories? Lyra's hand trembled as she placed it on the glass of the window. Memories of the war. Of what we lost. What I lost. Raf's heart sank. He had known that the Vayrari had experienced great loss during the war, but hearing Lyra speak about it so directly, with such pain in her voice, was something else. He could feel the weight of her words in his chest. "Tell me about it," Rafe said gently. "I can help you. You don't have to carry this alone." Lyra's shoulders tensed, and for a moment, Rafe thought she might pull away. But instead, she turned her eyes to him, her face filled with sadness. "I was there. I saw it all. The destruction, the death, the silence that followed." Rafe didn't know how to respond. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like to witness such devastation. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened to Lyra, it was eating away at her. The silence wasn't just something she had chosen. It was a result of the trauma she had endured. I can't forget," she continued, her voice trembling. "I lost everything. My people, my family. The war took everything. And after it ended, all that was left was silence." Rafe's mind raced as he processed her words. Lyra hadn't just lost her family. She had lost her entire world. Her people, her home. It was all gone. And the silence that followed the war had become a prison for her. It wasn't just the absence of words. It was the absence of life, of hope. "I'm so sorry," Rafe said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't imagine what you've been through." Lyra closed her eyes, a single tear escaping down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away, letting it fall freely. For the first time, Rafe saw her vulnerability. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crack. "I can't speak about it," she said quietly. "I can't let anyone in. The silence is the only thing that keeps me from falling apart." Rafe's heart ached for her. He could see now why she had been so closed off, so distant. She was trying to protect herself, trying to keep the world from getting too close. The silence wasn't just a choice. It was her shield, her way of keeping the pain at bay. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready," Rafe said softly. "But I'll be here when you are." Lyra looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I don't know how to speak about it," she said, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "It's too much to carry." Rafe reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm not going anywhere." Lyra didn't say anything, but she didn't pull away either. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, side by side, watching the stars. It was a quiet understanding, a bond that had formed between them. Rafe knew that Lyra wasn't ready to fully open up yet, but he was willing to wait. He would be there for her, no matter how long it took. "I want to help you, Lyra," Rafe said finally, his voice steady. "When you're ready, we'll face it together. We'll find a way to break the silence." Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you." As they stood there together, Rafe realized that this wasn't just about fixing a problem. It was about healing. And healing wasn't something that could be rushed. It would take time, patience, and trust. But for the first time, he felt like they were making progress. Slowly, but surely, the silence between them was beginning to break. The days after their conversation felt different. Rafe could sense a subtle change in Lyra. She wasn't as distant as before, though she still kept mostly to herself. It was as if a part of her had finally acknowledged that someone was there for her, even if she wasn't ready to let go of the silence entirely. Rafe kept his distance, respecting her need for space, but he was always there when she needed him. Sometimes they would simply sit together in silence, and that was enough. Other times, they would share small gestures, like a nod or a brief look. It wasn't much, but to Rafe, it was progress. But even as Rafe felt hopeful, he couldn't stop wondering what was truly keeping Lyra from speaking. There was a deep buried fear in her that she hadn't yet shared, and it gnawed at him. He wanted to help her, but he knew that she wasn't ready to face everything she had lost. He wasn't sure how much longer he could wait. It wasn't just about understanding her silence anymore. He needed to know how to help her break free from it. One evening, as Rafe was making his way through the station's corridors, he heard a strange noise. It wasn't the usual hum of the machinery or the quiet footsteps of the crew. It was something else. An odd, muffled sound, almost like someone was in distress. Curious and concerned, Rafe followed the sound, his heart racing. It led him to a small, empty room near the back of the station. The door was slightly ajar, and as he pushed it open, he saw Lyra sitting on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her eyes were wide with panic, her breathing shallow. Rafe rushed to her side, kneeling down next to her. "Lyra," he asked softly, but there was no response. She was staring at something in front of her, her body trembling with fear. Lyra's breathing quickened, and Rafe could feel the tension in the room. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to ground her. "Lyra, it's okay. You're safe. You're not alone." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, in a broken voice, Lyra whispered, I can't breathe. It's too much." Rafe's heart sank. He had seen the fear in her eyes before, but this was different. This wasn't just emotional pain. It was something deeper, something physical. It was as if she was trapped in a memory, reliving it all over again. "Lyra, look at me," Rafe said, his voice calm but firm. "Focus on me. Breathe with me. You're here. You're safe." Slowly, Lyra's eyes met his. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, but she was listening. Rafe kept his voice steady, guiding her through the breathing exercises he had learned during his time on the station. Inhale, hold, exhale, inhale again. It took a few minutes, but Lyra's breathing began to steady. Her trembling slowly subsided, and the panic in her eyes started to fade. She still looked shaken, but she was no longer lost in the grip of that terrifying memory. Rafe didn't speak right away. He just stayed by her side, offering his presence, his calm. He knew that sometimes words weren't enough. Sometimes all someone needed was someone else to just be there. After a long moment of silence, Lyra finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't used it in years. "I saw it again," she said, barely above a whisper. "The war, the destruction, the fire, the smoke, the bodies." Rafe's chest tightened. He had known that Lyra's silence was tied to the trauma she had experienced, but hearing her speak about it, hearing the raw pain in her voice, it cut deep. "Lyra, I'm so sorry. You don't have to relive that. You don't have to carry it alone." Lyra shook her head, her eyes filled with a mix of grief and guilt. "I wasn't supposed to survive. I should have stayed with them. I shouldn't have left. But I did. I ran and left them behind." Rafe felt his heart ache for her. He didn't know what had happened during the war, but it was clear now that Lyra had been through hell. She had witnessed the destruction of her people, and somehow she had survived. But the price of survival had been too high. It had stolen her voice and left her with nothing but memories. "Lyra, listen to me," Rafe said gently. "You didn't leave them behind. You didn't abandon anyone. You survived, and that's what matters. You can't change the past, but you can decide how to move forward. You don't have to carry that guilt. You're here, and that means you still have a chance to heal." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I don't know how," she whispered. "I don't know how to heal. How do I stop the memories? How do I stop the silence?" Rafe reached out and took her hand in his. "One step at a time. You don't have to do it all at once. We'll take it slow. We'll break the silence together." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then she nodded, her hand squeezing his in return. "Together," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Rafe smiled, relieved that she was finally willing to take that first step. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. The silence that had consumed her for so long was finally beginning to crack. The following days felt like a quiet shift. Lyra wasn't the same. The panic that had once gripped her so tightly still lingered, but there was something different now. A small crack in the walls she had built around herself. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Lyra was starting to trust him. Rafe knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing never was. But seeing her reach out, even in the smallest ways, gave him hope. He had promised her that they would break the silence together, and he intended to keep that promise. Lyra still avoided most of the others on the station, preferring the solitude she had always known. But she no longer avoided Raf. She would meet his gaze when he passed by, and sometimes she would sit beside him, silently, but at least present. There was no longer a barrier between them, and that meant more than anything. One evening, Rafe found her sitting near a terminal, her fingers tapping lightly on the screen, as if deep in thought. He hesitated for a moment before approaching. She didn't look up when he sat beside her, but her shoulders relaxed a little, as if she had sensed him. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Lyra glanced at him briefly, then turned her gaze back to the terminal. "I'm trying to find something," she said quietly. Rafe waited, giving her the space to continue. He had learned not to rush her. Slowly, Lyra spoke again. "Before the war, before everything was lost, we had records, knowledge, history." Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. "I've been trying to find some of it. Maybe there's something in it that could help me understand what happened, what I missed." Rafe watched her, sensing the weight of her words. It wasn't just about finding information. It was about trying to make sense of the past, about understanding the pieces of her life that had been shattered. "You don't have to do this alone," Rafe said softly, his voice steady. "Whatever you find, I'll be here." Lyra nodded but didn't speak for a moment. She scrolled through the terminal, eyes fixed on the data, as if searching for something she wasn't sure was there. Rafe sat quietly beside her, watching as the screen filled with old files, images of Verari history, records of their people, their culture, their technology. But nothing seemed to catch Lyra's attention. She kept scrolling, faster and faster, as if each document wasn't the one she was looking for. Finally, after what felt like hours, she stopped. "I found it," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found the last record." Rafe leaned forward. The last record. Lyra's fingers hovered over the screen, tracing the faded words on the document. "It's a message," she explained, "from the last council. From before the war. It was meant for the survivors." Rafe's heart raced as Lyra opened the file. The message on the screen was written in a language Rafe didn't understand, but Lyra seemed to recognize it immediately. Her eyes softened as she read aloud, her voice quiet but steady. "We, the council, do not know what the future holds. But we know this: our people will endure. The Verari will survive. And when the time comes, we will rise again." Rafe didn't know what to say. He could hear the weight of the words in Lyra's voice, and he could see the tears starting to well up in her eyes. "What does it mean?" he asked gently. Lyra looked at him, her expression filled with a mix of sorrow and hope. It means that we were supposed to survive. That the silence, the loss, was not the end. That there is still hope." She paused, taking a deep breath. But the message wasn't enough. It didn't reach us in time. We were already gone, and by the time we found it, everything had changed. Rafe could feel the pain in her words, the weight of the years she had spent without knowing what happened to her people. The council's message, filled with hope, had come too late. But in a way, it was still a message of survival. A reminder that despite everything, the Vereri still had a chance. "You're not alone," Rafe said softly. "You're still here. You're still fighting." Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, then wiped the tear that had fallen from her cheek. "I didn't want to fight anymore," she whispered. "I wanted to forget. But now I understand. I have to fight. For them. For us." Rafe nodded. He could see the resolve in her eyes, the fire that had been dormant for so long, now slowly reigniting. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living. About honoring those who had been lost and finding a way to move forward. "We'll fight together," Rafe said firmly. "You don't have to do it alone." Lyra gave a small, quiet nod. She didn't speak, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. There was still a long road ahead. There were still many memories to face, many pieces of her past to heal. But for the first time, Lyra wasn't just surviving. She was starting to live again. Rafe stayed with her as she scrolled through the rest of the files, her determination growing with each new discovery. Together, they would find the answers. Together, they would break the silence, piece by piece, until Lyra could finally speak freely again. And with each step, the bond between them grew stronger. Lyra stood before the observation window, staring out at the vast expanse of space. The stars stretched out endlessly, twinkling like distant memories. It had been a few weeks since she found the message from the council. The journey since then had been difficult, filled with moments of doubt and fear. But something had changed in her. She wasn't the same person who had arrived at the station, lost in silence and grief. The silence that had held her captive for so long was starting to fade. It wasn't gone completely, but it was no longer the thick wall it had once been. Lyra was starting to speak more, even when she didn't have to. Small words, simple phrases, but they were enough. And with each word, she felt herself becoming stronger. Rafe had been with her every step of the way. He hadn't pushed her to speak, but he had never left her side. He had become her anchor, the one person she trusted without question. And she knew, deep down, that she couldn't have come this far without him. But today was different. Today, Lyra felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Rafe," she said quietly, her voice strong and steady. Rafe, who had been working at a nearby console, turned toward her. His eyes brightened when he saw her standing there. "Yes." Lyra hesitated for a moment, then walked over to him, her step sure. "I've been thinking," she began, her eyes locking onto his, "about what you said. About moving forward. About not doing this alone." Rafe's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment was coming, but he hadn't expected it to feel so powerful. "I'm glad you're here," he said, his voice sincere. Lyra nodded, a small but determined smile forming on her lips. "I've been carrying this weight for so long," she said softly. "The memories, the guilt, the fear. But I think I'm ready to let it go." Rafe stepped closer to her, his heart swelling with pride. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Lyra looked out the window, her eyes soft but filled with purpose. "I know, and I don't want to." She took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to speak words she had never thought she would say. "I want to help my people. I want to rebuild what we lost." Rafe's eyes widened slightly, surprised but not shocked. He had seen the change in her, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. "You're ready?" he asked carefully. Lyra smiled, a genuine, confident smile that reached her eyes. "I'm ready." For the first time since they had met, Rafe saw the woman who had been hidden behind layers of pain and silence. He saw the leader, the fighter, the survivor, the woman who had lost so much but was now determined to rise again. "Then we'll do it," Rafe said, his voice filled with conviction. "We'll rebuild. Together." The two of them stood there, side by side, looking out at the stars. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and dangers. But for the first time in a long while, Lyra wasn't afraid. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer controlled her. She had found the strength to move forward. Later that day, Lyra and Rafe gathered the crew. The mission had changed. They were no longer just survivors on a station, drifting in the dark. They were now a team with a purpose. Together, they would find a way to help the Vereri people rebuild, to ensure their history and their future didn't fade into nothingness. Lyra stood in front of the crew, her voice clear and confident. "The war took everything from us, but we're still here. We've survived, and now we're going to rebuild. We'll find what we need to restore our people, our home, and our legacy." Her words were met with a mixture of nods and quiet applause. It was the first time Lyra had spoken with such certainty, and the crew could feel the change in her. They could see the spark of leadership, the fire that had been reignited. "We're with you," Rafe said, stepping forward beside her. "We'll follow you." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. But there was no longer any doubt. She had found her purpose, and now she would lead them all into a new future, a future where the silence no longer held them back. Later that night, Lyra stood alone on the observation deck once more. The stars were as distant as ever, but this time, they didn't feel so cold. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a team, a mission, and most importantly, she had a voice. Her past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. The woman who had been lost in silence had found her way back to the world, and now she would make sure her people would too. Lyra looked out at the stars, her heart full of hope. The journey wasn't over, but it was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra believed that together they could rebuild. Together they could rise again.